Breaking down another pre-draft rookie draft. That's what we'll be talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele, who continues to churn out fantastic stuff over at RotoViz. And Shawn, we've been talking about Dynasty a lot lately. I know for the listeners who pay attention or listen to all of our shows, they've probably heard me talk in the past that I'd kind of been souring on Dynasty a little bit, probably around last summer before you and I started this podcast. And every time you and I would wind up talking about Dynasty, I was sometimes a little bit like, I don't know if I really want to talk Dynasty. But doing this show with you and all the conversations we've had, you've definitely reinvigorated that part of me as a player. I'm very excited about some of these rookie drafts I've been doing. This one is a league that I'm in that you're not in, and I wanted to get your thoughts on some of the moves that I'd made in it. And I've already made 4 trades and moved around a bunch. I've made 5 picks now. I didn't enter the rookie draft with any of those picks. We're sitting at 208, and I'm still on the clock currently as we're recording this with potentially my 6th pick. This one was a pick of mine coming in. But I'm really enjoying it. I'm enjoying sort of this newfound enthusiasm for Dynasty and having a blast in this rookie draft where I've moved around a bunch. So I wanted to get some of your thoughts on some of the moves I made. But when I sent it to you, you noticed some other moves. And one that stood out to you right away was about Breece Hall. And you had been interested in talking about him. So I think we're going to kick off with a pretty huge trade that kicked off this particular draft to acquire Breece Hall. So that'll be a fun one to talk through as well. But how are you doing? And how excited are you for the NFL draft here? We're a week away.
We are, and I just don't feel like I've ever had this much fun with fantasy. And obviously I've been doing it a long time and loved it, or else wouldn't still be doing it. And so to have the 2022 offseason be such an adventure and such an exciting thrill ride, I think, has been just such a great experience. And you mentioned these rookie drafts. We've covered several of them. And one of the things we like to do with the rookie drafts is sort of frame out some of the important concepts for listeners and for dynasty managers, also for redraft and best ball, because these things are very relevant as listeners are tying up their final sort of pre-NFL draft best ball. And then we're going to have just a huge flurry of massive best ball tournament types of things going on immediately following the NFL draft. And it can be helpful, I think, to make sure we kind of calibrate our expectations pre-draft and that contrast post-draft. It's not that the post-draft is wrong, but we do want to make sure we're not making such big moves based on landing spots, especially if the players don't actually fall. If you're a Hakeem Butler or, you fall out of the draft entirely like an Allen Lazard, a player that we liked and stuck around and is now a relevant fantasy player. But there were several years in there where obviously he wasn't going to be particularly relevant after not getting drafted. So there are some moves that matter from that perspective, but there are also some things where maybe the exact order of some running backs shouldn't change a ton what we think. Having another back on an NFL roster shouldn't necessarily change what we believe to the point where you're moving him down big chunks, because we know that the talent is going to determine who pushes their way through. And that's even more true at wide receiver, where teams have multiple starters. And as you always like to point out, drawing targets is the receiver skill. It's what's going to determine whether or not they are a valid NFL fantasy player for you. And so making sure we know what we think about these guys before the NFL draft actually happens, I do think is important. That's one of the reasons why I like these pre-NFL draft, rookie drafts, but also just I love them because they're fun. And so you mentioned this trade that starts it off, and kind of what I'm seeing across a variety of formats is that in Superflex, you have those picks at the top are either Malik Willis, who very controversial, incredibly high upside, downside through the floor, a risky pick even in Superflex, but a justifiable one. And then Breece Hall, and maybe a little bit more of a controversial back than you might think considering what his profile is. But in your draft here, we get Willis number 1, we get Breece Hall number 2, and that is the result of a blockbuster trade that Curtis Patrick makes to move into the 102.
Yeah, Curtis moved the 111, 201, and Elijah Moore for the 102 while it was on the clock, knowing he was getting Hall, and the 302. This is going to be an interesting league. We had a couple people leave the league and need to be replaced. And we have always done the rookie draft before the NFL draft. And there was a lot of talk about dispersal or how to handle it. And so what ended up happening, sort of a creative solution was proposed that we're doing the rookie draft before the NFL draft still to get it in, kind of keep that on schedule. But then we're going to do a dispersal with protected players, and you can protect as many as you want after the NFL draft. And so some of these moves that we'll talk about are definitely influenced by that, by this element of kind of a unique thing where we're going to do, a dispersal later. And so maybe positioning for a dispersal, there may be an argument to try to consolidate talent. At the same time, we're also transitioning to a best ball, which would be probably an argument to get as much depth as possible. And so there's, multiple ways you might want to play that. It's definitely played into some of the moves that I've made. And I just want to lay that out because I'm not sure how much that may have or may not have influenced Curtis's valuation, but that was, an important element, I think, for me, certainly, like I said, when I was considering some of my trades. But Breece Hall ends up going for all this value. And you thought that was pretty interesting. And you were just telling me sort of before the show, basically how excited you are about Breece Hall.
I was. And Hall, interesting because he doesn't pop in some of the scouting things quite to the level of previous superstars. But at the same time, we have to remember that Jonathan Taylor, who everyone gets compared to now, and Breece Hall is a legitimate comparison to. He was the third running back that came out in terms of that class. And despite all of these massive breakaway runs that he had at the collegiate level, which he's been able to translate to the NFL level, and despite the just otherworldly combine, there were still a lot of questions because people are saying, well, he just, running through this hole and then running for a touchdown. Anybody can do that. Well, obviously everybody can't, or people would have Jonathan Taylor type numbers in college, and they don't. That's one of the reasons why this class is not particularly deep. When we kind of look through here, one of the other elements that's interesting with Hall is that he's projected from sort of the 25-ish to the 45-ish range in the reality draft. But I guess I wouldn't take that seriously because the difference between these guys, especially in the last 7 or 8 years, who go in the top 10 versus the players that go in the second round, there's not a lot profile-wise that actually makes them different. What is different is whether or not there's a team that is kind of crazy enough to use a top 10 pick at running back. Now, there are some other ways you can blow your top 10 pick as well. And if you get a generational runner, or not necessarily even a generational runner, but an impact player, if you get a Christian McCaffrey, then you're going to be very happy with that as your top 10 pick. But we have guys, like Dalvin Cook, like Jonathan Taylor, and some of the other backs who also went in that class late, who, you could make an argument for them in the top 10 of other drafts. So I wouldn't look at that part as being something that necessarily distinguishes. The other thing, and I like to kind of throw in some sort of bold prediction-ish kinds of takes at the very end of our shows so that listeners, when they do stick around, can get, maybe a fun thought that I had late. But I'll go ahead and throw in here that I think there's a chance actually that we see a surprise and that Breece Hall goes in the first 15 picks, that there's a team out there who isn't giving that away, because we know just a couple of years ago, there were teams that wanted Javonte Williams. People moved in front of them for him. If you want Breece Hall in the top 15 picks, you're not going to go tell people that. I think there's a chance he goes early because of this profile. You look at him in the box score scout, you can give him a number of different draft slots, but you're going to pull up some guys sort of big picture, like Dalvin Cook, like Todd Gurley, like Ezekiel Elliott. You pull him up in the Workout Explorer, and the most similar guy is Adrian Peterson, right? And then you pull him up in the Running Back Prospect Lab, and he gets a 98 score, and some of the other names, again, in that range are guys like Saquon Barkley, Todd Gurley, Ezekiel Elliott. Darren McFadden, Dalvin Cook, it's not like you can't miss. I mean, you can't miss prospects, I don't think. But when you look at what Hall did in college and then the ridiculous numbers that he put up at the combine, and think just, I mean, that validates what he did, even if his running style, his gait, maybe even doesn't look as fun and as explosive as some other backs who are more visually dynamic. The combination of production and actual tested athleticism more or less confirms for us that he's that guy.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, obviously exciting. I think the one thing I want to reiterate from all of that, sort of the most, is this idea that, especially, I think it's very different between positions, but especially at running back, where you noted that going in the second round is not any kind of concern really at all, because we do have to keep in mind the larger NFL trends, and it didn't used to be the case necessarily, or it was more common, obviously, 10 years ago for running backs to go in the top 10. We just don't see it as much, even in the last 3 years, in the last 5 years. There's just a lot more understanding at the NFL level of sort of, positional value, if you want to just put it that way. Certainly there's a lot of people that point out that it's pretty unfair to players who play running back that they get sort of treated this way. And that's, totally valid. But when we're sitting here analyzing it, number one, the one thing that we have to keep in mind is running backs can be more productive right away at the NFL level. That's been true for a long time. We still want our receivers to be productive right away, but there's, a little bit more of an understanding with receivers, especially, that with the rookies that we're targeting, we might actually be expecting them to sort of be building through their rookie year, getting better throughout that rookie year, maybe not hitting from week one. Now, obviously, like a Jamar Chase is a little bit of a different story, but and that sort of thing can happen at running back too. Javonte Williams, for example, maybe will be a year two explosion if Melvin Gordon's not back. But the possibility, I mean, when we think about it from Dynasty, we want to be targeting these rookies and second-year running backs regardless, in all formats. That's one of the big things that you and I talk about in all formats. And in Dynasty, there's this argument for targeting them, getting a lot of early production, seeing their value probably increase. You look at a guy like Najee Harris last year, was good, maybe not amazing, but that volume was enough that his value has been great. You can go, and then you can go trade them again. You get all this production, you can probably go trade them and then take the next year's rookie running back in your Dynasty league and continue doing this. And I think it's a smart, long-term process, probably to a certain degree. So there's that, that's one really important element. And as we consider, draft capital and those things, it's not, an issue that they might go into the second round. You mentioned Taylor going, 41st overall. He was the third running back in that class. Obviously, you as a Chiefs fan will always bring up that Clyde Edwards-Helaire was one of the ones that went ahead of him to the Chiefs. And it's not, for running back, it is so situation-based. It is so workload-based. It is so, we do care about talent, but it is so dependent on that landing spot and basically adequate draft capital. Are they getting enough positionally? Like Taylor went 10 picks behind CEH, who was the first running back that season. He obviously wasn't a guy who fell very, very deep. And now suddenly we're getting a little bit more information that maybe the NFL doesn't see him as a starter. That's a perfectly fine landing spot. Whereas a wide receiver in that range, maybe not quite as exciting as we start to get into the middle of the second round these days, because receivers still can go and more receivers are going in the first round. Now you're starting to talk about at the receiver position, you're talking about the 9th or 10th best receiver in the class, and maybe the NFL is not seeing that player as favorably. So yeah, very important to consider, I think, positionally, what the draft capital actually means. A high second round pick is a big difference for the two different, it's not a death knell for a receiver either, but it's a big difference, I think, for the two different positions. But what do you think about this trade where, I mean, obviously Elijah Moore is an ascending talent, very good player. It's super flex. So the 111 and the 201, both, pretty valuable picks because the quarterbacks are going to go. What, from like a value perspective, as highly as you think of Breece Hall, what did you think about this trade? I mean, I think Curtis, I think it was a really fair trade personally. I think, obviously he gave up quite a bit, but he puts himself in a position where, look, he's going to probably get Breece Hall production right away. And also, I think a value gain for all the reasons you just said, and then potentially could trade him after getting that production for a similar package a year or two from now.
Yeah, I'm looking at my Dynasty Superflex rankings with the tiers. Jonathan Taylor, the only running back in that top tier that reflects 3 first-round picks as sort of the overall trade value. Christian McCaffrey, Javonte Williams, DeAndre Swift, and Breece Hall in the second tier, and Hall at the bottom of that. As you and I were talking before the show, I was thinking I need to maybe tweak that a little bit, because the more I look at this, the more I think that Hall probably deserves to move ahead of Swift and Williams, and maybe even McCaffrey to the number 2 running back. Now, part of the reason that I have him at the bottom of that group is just to reflect the risk that we still have with the NFL draft. I mean, there are some situations he could get drafted into, either because the offense is very poor or the competition is more than you would want to see, that he wouldn't justifiably move ahead of that group. He'd still be very high, but wouldn't justifiably move ahead of that group right away. And so I want to reflect that risk. At the same time, when you're getting Hall, you're getting this young player who has just so many different ways to, number 1, score points for you, and number 2, improve and increase his trade value for you as you go over time. Whereas in all likelihood, McCaffrey is going to be dropping down a little bit in trade value as we go through these next couple of years. So we want to think about it in those terms. And one of the things I brought up to you was that we have been debating trying to move for McCaffrey in our RotoViz Triflex League over with the FFPC. And one of the offers that we made was similar to this, where we offered Elijah Moore, I believe, a late 1 and a mid 2. And a mid 2 in this particular draft could be a little bit different than an early 2. And so then we kind of look at the players who went in those spots. And we'll be looking about this again in a second, because one of these guys goes to you. But the 111 and the 201 are Desmond Ridder and George Pickens. And so you're moving, and it could have been different guys, but to kind of conceptualize it, you're moving Elijah Moore, Ridder, and Pickens for one player in Breece Hall. You and I did a show a little bit earlier in the offseason looking at the way that current best ball ADP would give us a sense of what some of these dynasty trade values should be. And the fact that Elijah Moore was going so early in these redraft types of formats gave us a sense that, look, I mean, you and I are very high on Elijah Moore. The numbers for him were fantastic. When he played last season, even within this horrible situation with the Jets, he was absolutely electric, to where you can look at him and dream of him being, the next Marvin Harrison or a player like that. That type of player would have huge value. On the other hand, one of the things that Curtis is obviously trying to do here is to minimize a little bit of his risk and say, look, I mean, the Jets want to add another receiver. They still have Zach Wilson, who I'm an optimist and enthusiast. And so I think that Wilson still has a chance. But after you look at that rookie season, I mean, there are some real problems. I mean, his rookie year comps are absolutely terrible. Most of those guys do end up falling out of the NFL. So you have a chance that Moore is number 1 with a bad QB in 2022. And then in 2023, they have to start over. Those things are going to, take a big chunk out of his points. If you move him now at a level where his trade value is already high, you don't have to deal with those risks. At the same time, when you do a 3-for-1, then you're centering a lot of your risk now in the health and also a little bit in the landing spot of a Breece Hall. I think this is interesting because we made a similar trade or similar offer for McCaffrey. The response we got was that, the pieces we were offering our league mate liked, but didn't like them at the value for McCaffrey. But if I'm thinking that Hall actually now is a similar dynasty value to Christian McCaffrey, then, I mean, this would at least be a justifiable trade and a very balanced trade from the perspective of, we were valuing Moore and these picks in a similar fashion in moves we were trying to make in our own league.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're still, I think, a little bit hopeful that we might be able to get something done. But I think you said all that well. The other thing that you pointed out to me was it was interesting to see sort of the order of the receivers in the first round. And this gets into some of the moves that I made that I wanted to get your thoughts on. I was sitting at 108, and it started Willis, Breece Hall, and Kenneth Walker went 103. And then Garrett Wilson goes 104, Drake London 105, and then Jamison Williams goes 106. So you see Treylon Burks starting to fall a little bit, and he was available a pick ahead of me, which was the first move that I went out and made. We were just talking about Zach Wilson. I came into this draft at quarterback being pretty thin. I had Matthew Stafford, I had Ben Roethlisberger, who is obviously now retired, and I had Zach Wilson. And last year, that managed in a league that was not best ball. I managed to be able to get 2 starting quarterbacks every week, and it was okay. It was obviously not good quarterback scoring with that group, but with Jonathan Taylor's actually on this roster and have a pretty strong, or it's not even necessarily that strong of a roster, but it was good enough that I was able to make the playoffs and but not really compete for the title seriously. We just did this startup 2 years ago. The year before, I was able to get to the championship and then get blown out. My team has not necessarily been good enough yet to compete. But I decided that in this draft, what my goal was going to be was to get into those rookie quarterbacks that we've talked about. And we'll get into sort of how I went about that. I think I wound up paying a pretty strong price to do that. And some of what we've talked about them being a little bit undervalued, I think they were properly valued where I wound up getting them. And so not necessarily thrilled with how that went. And again, part of why I want to talk to you about it. But the first move I made was to deal Wilson to move up from 108 to 107, and then also get the 207 and 209. And I actually got a question about this on Twitter, that it seemed like I was selling a little bit low on Wilson. The 207 and 209 were pretty important to me because I feel like and felt like when I was looking through, all of the picks that may go before that point, that was going to be right before sort of a drop off. And there are some valuable players still going to be available there that maybe weren't available, or were not going to be available at 212, for example. My initial offer was actually to go up to 105 and try to get the 203 and the 205 using Wilson. And that was close as I understood it. But the person I was discussing with didn't necessarily want to move both of those earlier second round picks. And so anyway, I wind up moving up one pick to take Treylon Burks. You said you had some thoughts on sort of the order that these receivers went in. They go Wilson, London, Williams, and then Burks to me, and then Chris Olave winds up going right behind Burks, which we tend to see Olave be sort of there always after the other receivers go. But Williams going ahead of Burks, pretty interesting.
It is, and yet I don't think necessarily a surprise as we see Burks start to fall down mock draft boards. The flip side of that we've talked about a little bit is just that could put him with the Packers or the Chiefs. And then I think he is the wide receiver 1. Burks is the guy who has the best adjusted production index score in Travis May's research. He has kind of the best combination of traits in the machine learning research that Blair Andrews has done. I think that he's the guy who has the most total upside in this draft. I know that you selected him early in one of your recent drafts, but then the kind of fun thing about this draft and why it's so fascinating at receiver is you have these kind of 2 buckets of sort of weird risk, where you've got the Ohio State guys and the guys who were connected to Ohio State in one way or another, and then you've got the big guys in Drake London and Treylon Burks. Burks basically, in terms of the way he was used in college, which some people consider to be a red flag, and I think is a red flag from the perspective of we don't know how some of the other things are going to translate. And if he can do some of those other things, and you think, well, what did he do? And you think of guys like Deebo Samuel and Laviska Shenault. You're like, well, I mean, those are 2 ends of the spectrum in terms of how that's working at the NFL level. And, if you get Deebo in the Burks package, then you're very excited. If you get Laviska Shenault, then, you're hoping that Laviska Shenault turns out to be good and isn't just the guy he was the first couple of seasons. With Drake London, we have this more limited sample, and you have the red flags that come with some of the things that he's done. At the same time, on the high end of that, you're basically thinking, okay, well, this could be Mike Evans plus, right? And if you get Mike Evans plus anywhere in a draft, but certainly at 105, you're going to be very excited about that. So Ben, you said you wanted to move up to 105. Who would you have taken if you got that pick? I mean, was Burks going to be your pick at 5? So Wilson goes 4, London 5, Williams 6, Burks 7, Olave 8, and you obviously moved up from that pick. So you had you could argue that you had a tier break, or just that you actually liked the 207, 209 that you got more. We'll talk about that in a minute. How do you see these receivers coming off the board here? What was your strategy with it?
Yeah. So you kind of hit on my trade thought process, which was I was looking at the RotoViz Dynasty trade tool that I talked about on prior shows. I think is an awesome tool and an easy way to get player valuations. I was looking at your rankings there, and you had Zach Wilson in a range where he was worth 2 seconds. I thought those seconds would be before sort of the tier break and still worthwhile picks and potentially maneuverable in the future in the sense that I might be able to use them to even move up a little higher if I had earlier second round targets, and a little foreshadowing, I did use one of them to move up again. And so part of it in my mind was, okay, well, Zach Wilson's probably worth roughly 2 seconds. I don't believe in his skill set that much. I took him last year more of as sort of like a value pick in the later first round, where it was kind of hard to pass him up as, basically the locked in second round or second overall pick at this point. It was a pre-NFL draft last year, but you'll recall that Zach Wilson was basically locked into that landing spot with the Jets. It was very, very widely known that was going to happen. And so I took him on this idea that, like, okay, maybe he's sort of this Justin Herbert of this class that people are a little bit down on, but has a lot of potential and not a very great rookie year. And so my mindset was, okay, well, maybe I should try to move out of that after 1 year. And it's something that you talk about a lot, where when we do take these rookies, even if we don't necessarily like them and don't really necessarily believe in them and they don't have a great rookie year, you can still maintain pretty good value. Don't feel like I lost a ton of value to get these 2 second round picks back. And then maybe if there was a little bit more that I was wanting back, that move up was justifying it, because I did feel like there was a pretty huge tier drop from Burks to anyone else at that point. It was like, okay, well, I can make sure that I get Burks instead of hoping that he doesn't go at 107 and then not really knowing what I would do at 108. Probably would have taken Olave, but I do think that's a pretty big gap. The answer to your question about what I was going to do at 105 is I was going to take Treylon Burks. And I'm developing this take on Burks that he's going to be the receiver that's going to move up in all formats the most after the draft, that he's the one that's being hit the hardest right now by not even necessarily certainties. Expected draft position has already been really baked in with Burks. This idea that he's not going to go, in the early part of the first round, which isn't a certainty, right? We don't know that for sure. That is sort of the expectation. One of the big data points in that is that the NFL invited the other 4 receivers to the actual draft. So Wilson, London, and Jameson Williams and Chris Olave will all be at the draft. Treylon Burks will not be. And that, I think, has influenced a lot of the mock drafts as well, and probably rightfully so. And now there's talk that Burks might not even be the 5th receiver off the board in the real NFL draft, that someone else might sneak in ahead of him. I still think it's very likely, from everything that we've heard and seen from throughout the entirety of the offseason, that he's going to go in the first round, especially because a lot of these comps that have been made about Burks are that he's sort of Debo-like and things. And all we've heard all offseason is that teams want to find the next Debo. These guys that can do all these multiple types of things. Even look at like a guy like Laviska Shenault, who's had 2 really bad seasons. We started to get trade buzz around him, that teams wanted to acquire him. They thought he still could play. You look at the fantasy industry, I don't think people are anywhere near as optimistic about Viska broadly as it sounds like some people in the NFL still are. And it's this class of player that I think the NFL is actually pretty intrigued with. And so my mindset is, okay, where people are already starting to look poorly on Burks because of expected draft capital that we don't know for sure is going to be terrible. even if he did slip into the top part of the second round, I think that's already sort of baked in. People have started to say maybe he falls in the second round. I don't think that's going to happen. Like I said, I think it's very likely he stays in the first. And so it's like we're already valuing him at this draft position that he hasn't actually landed at yet. So that's the first thing. The second thing is people keep talking about he's hard to project the fit to the NFL. But I've been looking at some of the data that I've seen on places like Twitter about the different types of routes and where people have gotten their targets. And one of the big knocks on Burks is that he got so many of his targets at or around the line of scrimmage or out of the backfield was used in those sort of Debo-ish type ways. And yet, I think it was Pat Carrain who wrote a little bit about him, where if you take out those screens and those things, he still had a dominator rating high enough to qualify for a breakout season. His production was strong, very, very, very strong in the SEC, that we can actually control for some of that other usage and not necessarily have to see it as a bad thing. Pat was also telling me last night when I was talking to him that he has like 50 something 20 plus yard targets over the course of his career, and his efficiency on those are absolutely through the roof. I think he told me his yards per target was over 25 yards per target. So Burks has shown an ability to get down the field. It's really interesting when we talk about these sort of narrative type driven things that Drake London is this contested catch player who I think people are saying, well, I can visualize how he's going to play. There's been these like Mike Evans comps and things, but you look at Drake London versus Treylon Burks actually, even with all of those massive high rates of targets at or around the line of scrimmage for his career, had an average depth of target 2 yards higher than London. Burks actually saw his average target further downfield, despite all those looks right by the line of scrimmage. One of the comps I've seen for London is that he's sort of going to be a Michael Thomas, or need to be, because his ADOT was sub 10 and got a lot of his work in sort of this big underneath role, sort of like, the wide receiver as a tight end, Michael Thomas type role. There's not a ton of big receivers that have done what Michael Thomas has done. A lot of those roles are obviously focused on these fast, quick slot receivers. And so I'm beating around the bush here, but my thought on Burks is we've seen him do enough different things and do them successfully that this narrative has become, I don't know how to project him to the NFL. And the way I'm looking at it is he's versatile. He can do some of the things that actually make him easier to project, because almost no matter what team takes him and how they might use him, I don't think he's going to struggle at those things. He showed an ability to get down the field. He showed an ability to win in a lot of different types of roles. I don't think he has to be in the Debo role. I think he's got a big body type and yak ability that, I don't like early in AJ Brown's career. One of the things I wanted out of AJ Brown or out of the Titans regarding AJ Brown was for them to throw him more balls near the line of scrimmage so he could create yak. But if Burks gets into a situation like that where he's not getting that type of work near the line of scrimmage, I think he can still win down the field and create yak down the field as well. And so there's this thing where, because he's done so much, because he was so versatile at the college level, he was a big slot, he played outside a little bit, people seem to think that means his landing spot matters more. And my argument is that means his landing spot matters less.
So what I'm hearing from you is that we have a combination of AJ Brown and Debo Samuel. So I think listeners are going to be pretty excited about that. I would throw out, even if you get the poor man's version of both of those guys combined, you're going to be pretty excited about that. The other thing I'm hearing from you is that I do need, even though those touches around the line of scrimmage and those touches deep would replace very well what Tyreek Hill did for the Chiefs. Obviously, those guys play differently, but in terms of how Hill was actually used on targets, that I need to be readying myself for during the actual draft itself, that the Chiefs are going to pass on Treylon Burks and take like Alec Pierce.
I hope not, because I still want Burks to land with a good quarterback, obviously, but I do think it's that would not be good for the Chiefs. The other player I wanted to mention, actually, while I was talking about him, this was something that happened with Justin Jefferson, was where we were really concerned about his slot role, but one of the really interesting things about his profile was as a sophomore, even when LSU didn't throw they had half as many passing yards as they did when Jefferson was a junior. And Jefferson was playing outside that year, his dominated rating, or at least his market share of yards, was higher as an outside receiver. And I thought that was a pretty interesting note about him coming in, where he had been successful outside and inside. And then when he got drafted, we were all concerned. I know I was a little concerned. Oh, well, they probably see him as a slot because that's where he had the most raw stats in college. And Adam Thielen has been the slot. And so now he's going to get this sort of Diggs treatment where he's pushed outside and it's not going to work. It has been no issue for Jefferson because Jefferson can play everywhere. And that versatility doesn't even mean that he has to line up in a given spot every single down. He can play inside, he can play outside on different downs. And that flexibility is a good thing. And that's, I mean, again, for me with Burks, like what he showed us is that he can run a lot of different types of routes from a lot of different alignments. You look at a guy like Drake London, I'm actually concerned. Like, yeah, you can see that how an NFL team might use him, and we can say and hope that the team that drafts him is going to use him that way. But I'm actually concerned about him because we didn't see a ton from him in different usage. He wasn't great his freshman and sophomore year, very strong junior season in a certain type of role. What if he gets drafted and used differently than that? What if he is treated as more of a downfield guy and that ADOT stuff that I was talking about actually becomes a concern? He doesn't separate enough down the field. The contested catch stuff has been widely discussed. I still think London has a lot to like in his profile, and I don't think he's like far behind Burks or anything. But what do you think about that idea that like a guy like him is actually the one that needs the right landing spot and the right type of usage to really maximize his potential vis-a-vis Burks?
That could definitely come into play. I don't think that you want to be a jump ball receiver at the NFL level. Now, if you can add that in, I mean, if you're a contested catch guy, that's going to be fantastic, but it needs to be both. You have to be able to separate and make the contested catches. One of the things that you and I kind of jokingly go back and forth on, and now I feel like I've lost because Matthew Stafford is the perfect quarterback for Allen Robinson. But even before the collapse last season, Robinson is not separating, right? He's not actually getting open. His quarterbacks are forcing him the ball because they don't have other options. And then Robinson is able to make some of those plays. So if your quarterback is willing to still target you and you are a good contested catch guy, that can work out. But when you're looking for stars, you're looking for guys who do all of these different things, get open, and then can go up in the air and make plays to where the quarterback's like, you're covered, I'm going to throw you open at that point too. That's how you end up getting a guy who is a 28, 29, 30, 31% team, market share type of guy at the NFL level because they can do everything. But the other element of this that I think is interesting, and one of the reasons why the analytics, I think, work out for us in some of these situations is that receivers at the college level are reliant upon the quarterback that they have and the coaching staff that they have, the scheme that they are put into, and you're asked to thrive within that, not necessarily do things that you're not allowed to do within that scheme. And you do see situations where some college coaches are going to put guys in situations to succeed because they couldn't otherwise. But you also have situations where the number one thing you want to do is just see a guy who dominates within the context of what their role is. And so I think that we can look back and you see different things, and you see like Nikhil Harry, for example, and people look back and be like, well, we should have known that it wasn't going to translate well to the NFL because the things that he did in college, those aren't the things that we want to see from NFL receivers. And instead, the takeaway should be that you're going to have some misses, and not everybody translates. Not everybody has necessarily either the work ethic or the ability to actually make that jump in the way that exactly their profile and their skill set really did work. But you shouldn't go back and be like, now we're going to try and avoid those types of players, because big picture players who are really good are much more likely to succeed than taking someone else who was less successful. You're like, I like their traits, I think this is going to work out. What we see over and over in the articles that I've done for this site, kind of looking at, who are the guys that emerge late in rookie drafts, for example. You're talking about athletic freaks and guys who are hugely productive. You don't go back through there and say, okay, well, this was a guy who actually wasn't good in college and is a mediocre athlete, but he had traits and an NFL team was able to unlock that. You don't see those kinds of things. And so while I think that it's really cool to have all of this extra information, and Scott Barrett had a lot of cool stuff for us on OT that's going to release tomorrow, talking about how some of these Ohio State guys manifested at the college level. But I do think that we want to be looking at players who were good big picture and believe that their teams are going to then unlock what they do at the NFL level. We do know that the quarterbacks that these guys get at the NFL level are going to be hugely responsible for some of the efficiency elements. And that goes back to the targets per route run. We're looking for guys who can get open, guys who can draw targets. And year after year, your best way to get those guys is going to be to get the guys who were dominant college players.
I love your point about Nikhil Harry, because I think a lot of people have spent a lot of time trying to figure out how we avoid the Nikhil Harry type, like you said. How do we avoid making that mistake again? And what I'm hearing from you has sort of been my mindset, which is, how do I put myself in position to make that bet again? Because I'm comfortable with the decision to draft Nikhil Harry a couple of years ago in Dynasty. I think it was a smart decision based on all of the information that we have and continue to have about these types of players that produce in these ways like you are talking about right now. The answer shouldn't be, like you just said, that we need to try to avoid this exact type of player like Nikhil Harry, which, first of all, no two player is identical, right? And so and you mentioned some of the off-field stuff that we can't always quantify, and Harry's had some injury issues and other things, but work ethic, whatever it may be, culture fit, if you want to throw that out there with the Patriots, because we know that's been a big thing with the Patriots. But I want to be in a position where I can make that bet again on a similar player. I would make that bet again, obviously not knowing what we know now, but if we didn't know and we had a very similar type of prospect, and especially if the market is now trying to discount those specific things about Nikhil Harry, I would want to make that bet again and be comfortable just saying that Nikhil Harry was a miss, like you said.
And, we look at the Nikhil Harry pick for the Patriots, and one of the things the Patriots have done actually is to pick a bunch of guys who actually weren't that great at college players. And then they get this chance and they pick a guy who actually did check a few more of the boxes, and they get criticized for that as well. And you have all the narrative stuff coming out where his scouts were telling him, Debo, AJ Brown. And, it's just the hindsight element of that is so glaring, because you're looking at it and you're saying, now Bill Belichick doesn't understand football because he picked Harry over Brown and Samuel. All three of those guys looked like good prospects. We obviously loved AJ Brown, and he's been on the other side of that, where it's manifested in the NFL in such a fantastic way. But, if Bill Belichick can miss on a guy who looked good like that, then, obviously fantasy managers are going to miss on it from time to time. You prefer to see them miss on someone who checks some very important boxes than to reach 3 or 4 rounds and do kind of the Chiefs thing with the running back position, where it's this hubris element and overconfidence element where they're saying, look, here are some traits we think can work. That didn't work for them either. So now they have a situation where they've got Kendrick Bourne, and Ben, if you got Kendrick Bourne, you were all set. So let's get into these trades that you made that are really cool in terms of the way that this draft developed.
Yeah, so after Burks, Olave goes. And full disclosure, when I traded for the 207, 209, I didn't think that I'd get a QB there, but we had talked about one of your drafts, a super flex draft, where some of the QBs had fallen enough that I thought it was at least in the realm of possibility, but not likely at all. But Kenny Pickett goes 109, Matt Corral goes 110. And right before Corral went, once Pickett had gone off the board at 109, I was kind of the mindset that I was certainly going to need to move back up at that point. We were going to need a lot more picks and people to not value the quarterbacks before the quarterbacks got dipped into again for me to have a shot anywhere, after the midpoint of the second round. And like I said, I didn't think it was a likely scenario that I would wind up with any quarterbacks at 207. But at this point, I'm sitting on just Matthew Stafford, and I did want to try to tap into these rookie QBs. Like I said at the top of the show, I thought, trading out Zach Wilson and getting 2 rookie QBs, for me, since we've already seen a year from Wilson, maybe provided more overall upside to my roster. And I'm hopeful that both of those guys could hit and potentially hit in a way that's better than Wilson. But I wanted to do that cheaply, and I wound up sort of not doing that cheaply, which was sort of what I said at the top of the show. I wind up moving right before the 110 pick is made into the 111 and 201 that Curtis had traded away that we talked about. Same manager has both of these picks. And I traded, we got to talking, and he said he liked A.J. Dillon, Cortland Sutton, and David Njoku among players on my team. And we talked about a couple different things. I did not want to give up A.J. Dillon, who listeners of the show know that I'm very high on. At the same time, this is a roster that I've mentioned has Jonathan Taylor, and we are shifting to best ball. And so I kind of was thinking, I can afford to move off of AJ Dillon. I like Dillon in best ball because he's the kind of guy that obviously can have a 100-yard, 2-touchdown rushing game. He's also the kind of guy that can string together 4 catches in a game. And then he's going to have some games maybe where he's not used as much, and Aaron Jones is going to be great. But I was thinking this team wins with Jonathan Taylor already. And so if I'm locking in Jonathan Taylor sort of as my weekly star running back, I almost want to build a modified 0 RB Dynasty roster. It's not the end of the world to move off of Dillon and then have this plethora of, committee backs maybe, or guys that can do different things in best ball that might be able to fill my RB2 spot every week and then be really deep everywhere else, basically, right? So that was sort of my mindset. It's like, okay, well, I can move off Dillon if I need to. But I wound up packaging all 3 of these guys, Dillon, Sutton, and Njoku. Like I said, I initially was willing to move Sutton and Njoku, and then I ended up adding Dillon. I got both the 111 and 201, and then also a 2023 second, which I was trying to also get another early second-round pick in this draft. But the interesting thing about the 2023 picks is with this dispersal we're going to, the 2023 picks are not going to be a part of the dispersal. They're just like auto-protected. And so by picking up that 2023 second, I basically move some value into a range where I'm not going to have to protect those picks, and they'll be with me regardless. But yeah, I get to the 111 and 201, and then when I got on the clock, talked to the manager at the 112 and basically said, hey, are you thinking about taking a quarterback? Because when Corral goes, now I wanted to make sure I got both Ritter and Howell, which frankly were my 2 favorite options. We talked on the show a little bit. You talked about Howell last week and got me really excited about wanting to get him here. I already got Ritter in my other league, so I was going to take Howell if I only got one of these guys. But I also really like Ritter's potential and talked about that last week as well. But I talked to that manager, was able to move up the 1 pick from 201 to 112 because they weren't really interested in a QB by just using KJ Osborne, basically. And so essentially I end up moving AJ Dillon, Cortland Sutton, David Njoku, and KJ Osborne in a league that's moving to best ball, and depth is important in best ball, just to take these 2 quarterbacks, which there's a lot of risks with. And I know, again, from a value perspective, this is not exactly the value that we were talking about last week, is what makes them appealing right now. I mean, this is fair value. They shouldn't necessarily be going any higher than this, but it is still 2 quarterbacks that I think have pretty decent long-term upside profiles and should get draft capital. And like I said, on this roster, all I had was Stafford. So now I'm back up to 3 quarterbacks. What do you think about the value of that trade?
This one is fascinating, and I like it, but you have to be aware of the risks because you're taking 2 somewhat wild cards for 2 established NFL players who are good players and are going to have real value for the next couple of years. The QBs you've drafted, as much as we like them, we've also stated that there are very real scenarios where their value is pretty minimal a little bit over a week from now. At the same time, there's also a scenario where a week from now, you wouldn't be able to trade AJ Dillon for either one of them. You wouldn't be able to trade Cortland Sutton for either one of them. And getting that 2023 second, I think balances this out nicely to where you have more potential scenarios, more potential pathways in which you could win. And Dillon and Sutton are both players I'm trying to move off of, even though I like, right? Cortland Sutton right now, you have this open-ended opportunity for, people envision him as the potential just breakout star of this Denver Broncos offense with Russell Wilson. That's a fairly likely outcome. The other fairly likely outcome that is positive for people who have Sutton is just that he'll be good. And a good player in that range with wide receivers, especially in best ball, that has a lot of value for you. If he stays healthy for 3-4 years, it's going to be hard for that value not to pay off. But the other scenario, similar but very different specifics than with Elijah Moore, is that either one, Russell Wilson does struggle a little bit because he gets a little bit older, the mobility drops down a tad bit, and as a result, he's not the same overall quarterback. But with that is the fact that there's a real chance that Jerry Jeudy is the breakout star of this offense. There's a real chance that Albert O is the breakout star of this offense. There is a legitimate chance that Tim Patrick takes more targets than we would really like and siphons off enough that those other guys don't make a huge impact. And there's this tiny little chance that KJ Hamler,
huge chance
that KJ Hamler is the star. I continue to take him in almost every draft. So we can know that it's tiny. With all of that, I think that you actually want to sell this upside scenario right now where you're getting good value out of it. A.J. Dillon is in a similar kind of situation to where once they really brought Aaron Jones back and made him the starter and the star, you're talking about a backup running back or a committee running back. Probably the best committee back in the NFL, with Kareem Hunt, quite possibly. But you need things to go right for it to work out for him. He's moving along in his sort of dynasty trajectory. And one of the things that we talk about with the running backs especially is that you need to get them very young and very early because their best efficiency and their biggest scores are often early. Their ability to see the trade value rise comes early. And then the fall off. And anybody who has, someone like an Alvin Kamara, Dalvin Cook, and what those guys are going for, and you're talking about very recent superstars, you can't get a ton for them. And we think, but AJ Dillon is younger than that. It's like, yeah, but you have to play the guy and then trade the guy before he gets to that point, because then once he does get to that point, it's too late. And so even though AJ Dillon, there's a lot of ways in which it could work out that he is an impact player in 2022. He is now into that portion of it, even though he's still young. We're like, yeah, now you still have to trade him before he gets, over that sort of goal line in terms of trade value. And so I like moving off of both of those guys, even though we like those guys. And so from that perspective, I think this is a win-win trade. I think that you've accomplished what you needed to accomplish, because in Superflex, at some point you have to pay. It's not like you can just magically have quarterbacks. You have to pay. You have to find places where it's a good sort of risk-adjusted price. And as you mentioned, it would be great to have gotten these guys 203, 204. These are not bad prices. You have to be happy with what you've accomplished here.
Yeah, I mean, my hope obviously is that one or both of them lands in a good spot with good draft capital and is good. And if they are, we talked about this as well last week when we did the whole show on the quarterbacks. They're going to be first or second round startup values next year, probably second round. But, Fields and Lance and those guys are right now and didn't even have necessarily good rookie years. They had much higher pre-draft expectations and then also good landing spot. I mean, draft capital especially, but pretty solid landing spots as well. Obviously, Lance hasn't got on the field yet in his pretty good landing spot. And Fields isn't necessarily in a great landing spot, but at least he was able to, immediately become the franchise quarterback, which is a positive. But the draft capital for them is probably going to be better than either of Ritter and Howell, and potentially a lot better. And so there is this concern that Ritter and Howell could be backups. Part of what led me to this trade, which I did think, I was not excited about getting off Sutton or Dillon or whatever, but we have this interesting element with the upcoming dispersal where now I take these guys and there's a possibility, right, that Ritter or Howell falls in the second round, lands as, clear backups or, sort of like what happened with Jordan Love a few years ago where they, some team like the Packers picks them. Obviously the Packers won't be doing that again, but that they're stuck behind a star quarterback for a period. Because we're doing this dispersal coming up and there's these protections and everything, part of my mindset was like, well, there's this really wide range of potential outcomes in the NFL draft where they could land in some really great spots and their value could jump quite a bit right away. Like you said, even before they play, or if they land really poorly, I mean, obviously it's just a waste of resources, but I could just not protect them. And then it allows me to do something different in this dispersal that we're going to do upcoming. So part of me was like, okay, I'm taking on this risk, but in the disaster outcome, I mean, I can just get off the off ramp a little bit. I could maybe protect a lot fewer players and try to rebuild a lot of the roster. So it is a really unique element to this particular league, but it was part of something that I was considering with really wanting to get into the quarterbacks in this rookie draft was we think that there's a really basically wide range and more upside in the landing spot and the draft capital than people are realizing. And then the value increase post NFL draft. We also have to acknowledge that there's downside. But if we think that there is that upside, and I can also potentially mitigate some of the losses if there is downside, then I thought that was kind of interesting. So at this point, I had taken Burks and Ritter and Howell, and I had the 207, 208, and 209 back to back to back because I had traded for the 207 and the 209, and the 208 was my original pick. And a couple picks went by, George Pickens and Isaiah Spiller, and I was looking at it and counting up who I expected to go. I expected Sky Moore, Christian Watson, and Jahan Dotson to all go. I also expected Trey McBride to go before my pick. And it would leave me with 3 picks, a couple interesting names at 207 and 208 that I would like to take, including David Bell. And I really like Justin Ross and thought he would be an interesting pick there. And then my other sort of potential 209 pick was going to be the other tight end, Greg Dulcich, I think it is. But I wasn't necessarily thrilled about having the 209 at this point. And so I wound up moving back up to 203 with that 209 using, and similar to the KJ Osborne trade I described, again, unique circumstances here, probably not worth diving into as much as I am, but using Cedric Wilson and Gus Edwards in the trade. And those are 2 guys that I'm not sure I would have protected. Same with KJ Osborne. I'm not sure those are guys that on my roster that I was going to protect. So I was trying to move into a more, clear protected type pick, and was able to trade the 209 to get up to the 203 and take Sky Moore over Dotson. Again, we talked about this last week on last week's show, so go back and listen if you're curious about Sean's take on that, because I already asked you about whether you would take him over Watson, Christian Watson, and Jahan Dotson, and they both went right behind Moore. And then Rachaad White actually went 1 pick ahead of me at 206, which I wasn't anticipating because there's some serious concern about his draft capital right now. And I was able to get Trey McBride at 207. I'm now sitting on the clock at 208. So, Sean, my initial Zach Wilson trade is complete now. And I wound up giving up Zach Wilson and the 108. So basically Zach Wilson and Chris Olave, as well as Gus Edwards and Cedric Wilson. And I got back Treylon Burks, Sky Moore, and Trey McBride in that trade, or pair of trades, if you will. What do you think about how that panned out with what I wound up doing with the 207 and 209?
I like it. It's been a big bonus for you that McBride fell to the 207 and gave you extra value that I don't think you could have counted on there. But looking specifically at the trade, to be able to get out of Wilson, to get back into some QBs, and to get these specific guys, regardless of whether you have Moore, Watson, or Dotson first, I think to be able to have a pick in that range is fantastic. That's one of the areas of the draft that I think there is quite a bit of value. And then the players that you get rid of, I'm probably a little bit biased here because I'm lower than the community on Gus Edwards and Cedric Wilson, even though those guys are not, big names. There are some very smart people who are still taking them in drafts and spots where I'm probably still off of them. You have the situation with Melvin Gordon, how that potentially play out probably would hurt Gus Edwards a lot more than J.K. Dobbins. I don't know if Gus Edwards is going to stay on the team. Cedric Wilson is a guy that I've really liked. Even as a prospect, I was surprised that he was one of those guys, the NFL teams weren't more interested in. He thrived with the Dallas when he got his chances. And yet, once you're behind Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill and Mike Gesicki in an offense where maybe your quarterback is a little bit limited and it might be very run heavy, then you're getting to the edge, like you mentioned. Why it's understandable why you wouldn't protect those guys. So to use them to move up and to get from that 209, that could be tricky. Now we do have some guys that we like there, and I know you've got interesting decisions you have to make about the 208. But to move up there and have that be kind of the final piece of this trade, I think you've accomplished the things that you wanted to accomplish. And at the same time, I think all of those trades were very balanced and could work out well for both sides.
Yeah, that's sort of how I felt. I had the exact same opinion on Wilson. I mean, unsurprisingly, sort of with you in terms of him as a prospect, and that's why I had him on this roster. And was excited to see what he did in Dallas, was excited for his potential in Dallas, and he signs a big deal in Miami. It's like, okay, well, that could still be pretty promising. But once Hill lands there, for me, it just looks like a guy who's going to not be as exciting a year from now in terms of, the dynasty valuation as he is now, which is very hard for me to imagine him getting enough work. He'll probably have some sporadic solid plays as their third receiver, but I mean, so much is going to be concentrated on getting Hill going and getting Waddle going. And then, like you said, Gesicki is there still and is a valuable player as well. So he was one that, like, I've always liked, but was similar to how you were describing, like the Sutton and AJ Dillon situations, where I think it's a good time to be moving if possible. I mean, obviously he's not going to be somebody who's going to be valued incredibly highly, but to move a couple of those types of pieces, and Edwards you talked about as well, to get to more, I thought was a pretty big jump from who might have been there at 209. Especially as I had expected that the McBride might have gone before me. I obviously didn't know this before making that trade, that I was going to be looking at McBride and then potentially also still, David Bell and Justin Ross or a couple other interesting receivers at this point. So it's been a really fun rookie draft. I'm going to leave it with Burks, Ritter, Howell, Sky Moore, and Trey McBride, which I think is a really nice haul. Some guys that I really like targeting. I gave up a lot of veteran value. I did add the 2023 second to make it all happen. But yeah, the key pieces gave up were Zach Wilson and AJ Dillon and Cortland Sutton and David Njoku and some others. But I think overall, I mean, this is a pretty decent example, right? I mean, I'm more curious about, I guess, your mindset on it, but a pretty decent example of how to reload in a rookie draft, right?
I like it. And one of the things that you've demonstrated here is, number one, it's fun to make a lot of moves in these rookie drafts. Number two, if you're willing to include players and pieces that other people would want, it's often possible to move around. I mean, every draft in every league is a little bit different, but don't assume that you can't get to where you want to be, but have the willingness to take risks and offer pieces like a Zach Wilson. Now, again, I mean, Zach Wilson's not a superstar, but within the context of this format, he's a piece that matters. And that's one of the reasons why, you immediately had someone reach out to you and ask kind of what you were thinking there. Cortland Sutton, AJ Dillon, pieces that matter. If you want to move around in these rookie drafts, offer pieces that'll let you do that, right? I mean, you can't do it for nothing. When people are trying to move in and I can't accomplish my objectives, it's like, you can't offer a 31-year-old role player that's not going to move you around. Offer pieces that matter, get younger, get players who have profiles and could take a big leap in value in the short term. I mean, we're talking about guys, and we've been talking about guys over the last month who have things that jump out as saying this type of player translates well to the NFL. A lot of other managers know this at this point. So you're going to have some competition for those guys. But also once you have them, because people are aware of these traits that do translate, as soon as you get buzz in the offseason, as soon as you get that big play in the preseason, as soon as the guy has a little Elijah Moore-ish stretch where he looks like a legit NFL player and maybe even an above average guy or a star, then the potential for that value to really jump and to change the overall value of your team around is significant. And so you want to have exposure to those guys so that you have a chance to really change your team, whether you're in a rebuilding situation or you have sort of a mature competitive team. We talk all the time about perpetual reloading. That's the way that it works. You get players to where when they have good plays in an NFL game, they get that value bump, and then you can look at it again. Do I need to move more of the value into the future? Can I package a couple guys to get a superstar? But the reloading element of it is what allows you to create that permanent championship window and compete for championships in your league. And with that, Ben, we'll get to the end of another fun episode of Stealing Bananas. I appreciate you sharing this league with me. A lot to go over. Tactically, we see player evaluations. We see guys move around. We talked about sort of calibrating our expectations pre-draft so we don't make too egregious moves post-draft with all of the emotion that comes from that. Talked about prospects, talked about Dynasty, talked about trade value. Had a lot of fun with this pre-NFL draft, rookie draft. Been in a league here with a lot of big names from the industry, so we know that that one is going to be very tight in terms of how the draft itself progressed. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretchen. You can follow at Yards Per Gretch. Make sure you're signed up for Stealing Signals and the NFL draft and post-NFL draft content that will be coming out there. As Ben mentioned in the intro, I've had the All the Metrics series coming out over the last week. You can check out a lot of the different tools and the sort of main pieces of actionable intel from the tools in that article, trying to make those a little bit simpler. So if you don't have hours to get in there and dive into the tools like some of us like to do, you can get the high points very quickly. That can be a benefit as you're doing your last minute prep. And then if you're not a subscriber, you can get the 10% off by using the coupon code RVRadio2022 at checkout. Ben, you and I did an underdog league in the previous show. That was a lot of fun. I even had some people immediately reach out and say they recognized that we were in there, and that Sam Howell pick was specifically to block us. And so that's always kind of fun when you have people interacting already with those leagues based on what they've heard on Stealing Bananas. When you sign up for Underdog, you can get the 100% deposit bonus up to $100. We're going to have more Underdog leagues for you soon. We're really excited to get into our RotoViz Triflex Dynasty League rookie draft. Then as we looked at this particular league today, I'm just thinking that draft is going to be the most fun draft that I've done in a long, long time. So we're looking forward to that over at the FFPC. Sign up to our feed. You'll get these shows when they come out. Leave us a rating and review, and tell Ben that Zach Wilson is going to be the key to his future championships. We appreciate all that you guys have done there. We'll talk to you soon.
Did you enjoy that clip? Make sure you hit that subscribe button to get more content from RotoViz. And of course, you can check out full-length podcasts at rotoviz.com/podcast. Available on all podcast platforms. Check out our wide range of content. Once again, rotoviz.com/podcast.